All right. So let's talk about what happens when the government does an expansionary fiscal policy. Now, again, this is aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis. And again, do we agree on all this stuff? No. But anyway, so we have short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand when the government increases spending. So we have a recession. The government says, hey, we're going to fight this recession by increasing unemployment benefits. They did something that they've never done before, and that's to give unemployment benefits to gig workers. So I have friends who are referees. I referee. I have friends who are referees. I have a job, so it doesn't apply to me, but I have friends who just referee for a living, and they got thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in unemployment benefits. So much, in fact, that some of them are talking about trying to stay on unemployment longer and not go back to reffing when the games start. Hopefully the government will catch on and not let them do that, but we're spending all this extra money, or we might go out and build roads. We might give money to the states for something, okay? So what happens when you have expansionary fiscal policy is that aggregate demand moves to the right. There's an increase in aggregate demand. And when that expansionary fiscal policy kicks in, you should increase real GDP. That's what this says. There's an increase in real GDP. And that increase in real GDP is going to create jobs. So in the short run here, because it's a short run aggregate supply, right? Increase in government spending shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. We get an increase in aggregate demand, and with it, an increase in jobs. All right? So the government in the short run, according to this model, the government in the short run can increase government spending and create jobs. There's a little bit of an increase in the price level, but we're creating jobs. Okay? But this is the short-run view of this theory, right? Remember that aggregate demand and supply says there's a short-run view of the world, and then there's a long-run view of the world. So what happens? What's the long-run impact of expansionary fiscal policy? So the government spends all this money, and in the short run, they create jobs. But over time, that impact of creating jobs goes away, and we end up with inflation because the government spent all that money. Okay? We get inflation. Aggregate demand moving to the right causes inflation against the long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay? So short run, this theory says in the short run, the government creates jobs. In the long run, it creates inflation. We got that? Okay. All right. So in this theory, in aggregate demand and supply, it doesn't matter how the government increases aggregate demand. We got the same graphs for monetary policy as we got for fiscal policy. In the short run, monetary and fiscal policy in this theory can create jobs. And the reason is you have sticky wages. Wages don't move the way they're supposed to. Sticky wages and prices, right? This sticky wages and prices model. Because they're sticky wages, we get a connection between the nominal values and the real values. So nominal things can affect real things in the short run because we're sticky. Once we get done being sticky and we're not sticky anymore, the nominal becomes separate from the real, and we end up with inflation. Okay? So, an increase in aggregate demand creates jobs in the short run and inflation in the long run. That's aggregate demand and supply. Okay? And again, you're perfectly welcome to say, it just creates inflation, and it doesn't create jobs ever, because there are economists who say that. Or you can just say, and you have to do this in a British accent, and I don't have a British accent, but you have to do it in a British. Say, in the long run, we're all dead. And there is no long run, and it doesn't create inflation. All right? So you can take any position in between from one extreme to the other. What you have to be able to do that is justify your position. Justify your explanation. Okay? That's like science or something. Okay. Now, there's another theory. And here's this. It's actually part of the same. Remember that on on that thing, GDP is going up. So how did we make aggregate demand increase? Well, when aggregate demand increases, when GDP goes up, when we get an increase in real GDP, we're going to have an increase in the demand for money. Okay? And it could be, in part, it's because the government goes out and borrows, right? The government has to go out and borrow money. And consumers are going to pay higher prices. They need more money. They want to buy more stuff. They need more money. So we're going to see an increase in the demand for money, and that's going to raise interest rates. So, again, there's a big chunk of economists out there who would say when the government spends money to do something like fight a recession, it's going to drive up interest rates. And when the government raises interest rates, it pushes the private sector out of the market. And we have a term for that called crowding out, and I wrote that down here in a second. But the idea is that when the government goes and borrows money to do something, it might not actually be expanding the economy in the sense that it's just taking money away from the private sector. So when the government goes out and does this stimulus and spends hundreds of billions of dollars to stimulate the economy, there are economists who argue all it's doing is making the government bigger and the private sector smaller. Okay? Crowding out, making the government bigger, private sector smaller. For this to work, for the government to spend money and make the economy better, that means the government can make the economy larger without making the make the government larger without making the private sector smaller. Okay? Now, a counter argument. Again, what I just said. If you're going to argue one way or another, you need to have some evidences. Well, as the government was spending all this money and making the economy, making the government bigger, right? Spending more money from the government, making the government spending bigger. What was the Federal Reserve doing? Yeah? So we have this increase in aggregate demand that would push interest rates up. Okay? But what's the Fed doing? The Fed, at the same time we're doing this, is increasing the money supply. Increasing the money supply pushes interest rates down. So people use words like accommodating, like the Fed can accommodate the government or whatever. And so instead of interest rates go up and crowding out happening, interest rates would stay the same, or even interest rates went down over the last couple months. So the federal government was pushing all this spending out into the system, right? Putting billions and trillions, actually, of dollars out into the system for spending purposes. The Fed's lowering interest rates. Okay? So we see an increase in the money supply, which is bigger than the increase in the money demand, and interest rates stay the same or go down. Okay? So that would mean that the Fed, again, is accommodating this spending by the federal government. And then people would say, again, and you get to argue and discuss this, but some people would say, well, all that means is aggregate demand is shifting out twice. The government shifted it out and the Fed shifted it out, which means when the inflation comes, it's just going to be that much worse. Okay? Now, you can have counter-argument, but so we might get this thing called crowding out, again, where an increase by the government, when the government goes to spend money, it ends up just pushing out the private sector, and it doesn't make the economy bigger, it just makes the government bigger and the private sector smaller. Okay? That's crowding out. And people like Milton Friedman in the past were big fans of this idea of crowding out. Okay? But again, short run, long run. So the last recession we did a stimulus package, right? The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. There were actually a couple of spending things that the government put in. The Bush administration put in a thing called TARP, and it was supposed to do certain things, and it sort of never did what it was supposed to do, but it did other things. And either way, they spent a lot of money. And then in the Obama administration, we had the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. It was passed right after Obama became president, like right after, a month after he became president. Okay? So it had things like $150 billion in it for road construction. They talked about having projects that were shovel ready, like it could start right away. But as it turned out, most most of that money didn't get spent till that summer. So it was 4 or 5 months after the money became available that they started spending it. In Nevada, it took us a year before we started spending our money. So the money was appropriated to Nevada in the spring of 2009, and Nevada didn't start spending it until the spring of 2010. And that's because the state basically decided it was going to spend all the money in Reno and rural Nevada and not spend any of it in Las Vegas. And you can imagine that a fight broke out since most of the population and most of the money in Nevada is in Las Vegas. And we still ended up with nowhere near what anybody would say is a fair share, unless you're from Reno and you think that anything above zero for Las Vegas is fair. But shovel ready, it gave money to the states to spend on things, particularly Medicaid. It targeted biomedical and green industry things. So if you've ever driven to California and there's an electrical power plant, a solar power plant right on the border, it's just on the California side of the California-Nevada border, that had some funding from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It was part of that deal to try to get more green energy going. It had some tax cuts in it. Strangely enough, I always get upset because there were Bush tax cuts and I didn't make enough money to get a Bush tax cut. And then there were Obama tax cuts and I made too much money to get the Obama tax cut. And I always like, where's my tax cut? All right. Did it work? And again, guess what? Yeah, it depends on who you talk to. So your answer could be yes, no, or maybe, depending on who you ask about the effect of this. One obvious thing is that of that $150 billion on roads, $90 billion of it got spent in the summer of 2009, and that's when the recession officially ended. So again, there's cause and effect and all these other things about whether or not that's the thing. But the recession officially ended 5 months after it passed. And it might have been, there's all kinds of arguments and discussions and about it. And I'm not going to bore you going through all of those. But let's just say there are people who argue that thing didn't work at all. There are people who thought it worked great. And the Congressional Budget Office is in the middle of it. It worked, but it didn't really end the recession. It didn't really start a good movement toward right. It helped to stop the recession, but it didn't really make a strong recovery. Okay? So if you go read about it, you can get all the different opinions. Okay? We know that only half of the tax cut was spent. Only half of the tax cut was spent. And I will tell you that the World Bank, think about that, right? The economy is bad, people are losing their jobs, you cut people's taxes. Well, I'm scared, right? I'm worried about the future because people are losing their jobs. So some people go, phew, they get that tax cut back and they can use it to pay bills and they can use it to do things, but they're not doing new spending with it. They're covering the expenses that they lost because they lost their job. So that's not really adding new spending. And then lots of other people are going to hold on to it. They're just going to grab it and hold on to it because they're worried about whether they're going to keep their job or keep their hours or whatever. Okay? The World Bank did a study of 180 expansions and recessions across the world, planet Earth. Okay? From the time they did this study, it was the prior 180. And what they found was that when times are good, playing with taxes is the most effective way the government has to influence the economy. That it has much stronger effects on the economy than changing spending of the government, that taxes are the most powerful tool the government has. Then they also found that the worse the economy is doing, the worse the recession, the less effect taxes have on what happens, and the more effective direct government spending is. So that study in the real world suggests that the right thing to do for the government at any one time depends on the economic situation. And the better the economy is doing, the more the government should work on changing taxes to try to change incentives and change what's going on. And the worse the economy is, the less the government should play around with taxes and the more it should just directly spend money to make things happen. Okay? Again, not everybody agrees on these things. There's also a lot of argument that the targeted stuff didn't really work at all, that we didn't get much out of the stuff that was targeted at specific industries, and that wasn't helpful. We've been better off putting more money into roads and bridges and basic infrastructure things. Even though it turns out the United States, if we want to build a road, we spend more than anybody else on the planet Earth to build that road. We used to be very fast and efficient at infrastructure projects, and over time, studies of state and local governments show that road projects take longer, cost more, we're less efficient, and if you drive around Vegas, I'm sure you probably agree with that. All these questions are good questions.